To understand why this certification delay matters so much, we need to step back and examine what the C919 represents for China. For decades, commercial aviation has been dominated by two names: Boeing from the United States and Airbus from Europe. Together, these giants control roughly 90% of the global market for large passenger aircraft. Airlines around the world have essentially two choices when purchasing new planes. This duopoly has shaped everything from aircraft pricing to maintenance networks to pilot training standards. China, as the world's second-largest economy and home to the fastest-growing aviation market on the planet, has watched this dominance with increasing frustration. Chinese airlines have spent hundreds of billions of dollars purchasing aircraft from Boeing and Airbus. Every plane purchased represents not just money leaving the country, but also technological dependence on Western powers with whom Beijing has increasingly complex relationships. The vision was clear: develop a homegrown commercial airliner that could serve Chinese domestic routes initially, then expand internationally to capture a share of the global market. If successful, China wouldn't just save money, it would gain strategic leverage, create high-skilled jobs, and prove to the world that Chinese engineering could compete at the highest levels of technological sophistication. Enter the Commercial Aircraft Corporation of China, known as COMAC, established in 2008 specifically to turn this vision into reality. The company's flagship project would be called the C919, with the C standing for both China and COMAC, and 919 representing its capacity of up to 190 passengers and its symbolic connection to the perpetual success implied by the number 9 in Chinese culture. The ambition behind the C919 is staggering. The Chinese government poured between $49 billion and $72 billion into the program, an investment that dwarfs the development budgets of most aircraft projects. This wasn't just about building a plane. It was about announcing China's arrival as a legitimate player in one of the world's most challenging industries. The C919 was designed to directly compete with the Boeing 737 and Airbus A320 families, the workhorses of commercial aviation. These narrow-body, single-aisle jets are the bread and butter of airlines worldwide, used for short to medium-haul routes that constitute the majority of commercial flights. Getting this category right means accessing a massive market. According to Airbus projections, China alone will need 9,570 new passenger aircraft between 2025 and 2044, with more than 80% being single-aisle jets, exactly like the C919. The business case seems solid. COMAC could price the C919 competitively. Estimates suggest around $70 million per aircraft, compared to as much as $110 million for comparable Western models. For airlines, especially in developing nations, that price difference could be transformative. But building an airliner capable of competing with Boeing and Airbus proved far more difficult than China anticipated. The timeline for the C919 has been, to put it mildly, tumultuous. When COMAC announced the program in 2009, they initially scheduled the maiden flight for 2014 and delivery to airlines by 2016. Those dates came and went. The aircraft didn't take its first flight until May 2017, 3 years behind schedule. Then came years of testing, modifications, and delays. The C919 finally entered commercial service with China Eastern Airlines in May 2023, roughly 7 years later than originally planned. That first delivery was celebrated as a milestone, but it was just one aircraft. In 2023, COMAC managed to deliver only 2 planes. In 2024, that number rose to 13. Progress certainly, but nowhere near the scale required to compete globally. For 2025, COMAC has set a target of 30 deliveries, with aspirations to eventually reach 150 aircraft per year within 5 years. To put that in perspective, Boeing and Airbus each deliver hundreds of aircraft annually. Even reaching COMAC's ambitious targets would leave them far behind the established players. The challenges extend beyond production speed. Building a modern commercial airliner requires mastering thousands of complex systems that must work flawlessly together. The aircraft must be safe, reliable, fuel-efficient, and comfortable. It needs to meet strict noise regulations, emission standards, and operational requirements. Every component, from the engines to the flight controls to the cabin pressurization system, must function perfectly in coordination with every other component. And here's where the story gets complicated. Despite being marketed as China's homegrown aircraft, the C919 relies heavily on foreign technology. Approximately 80% of the aircraft's suppliers are American and European companies. The engines, arguably the most critical component, come from CFM International, a joint venture between America's GE Aerospace and France's Safran. These LEAP-1C engines power the aircraft, and without them, the C919 cannot fly. Other crucial systems also come from Western suppliers. The flight control systems, avionics, communications equipment, and many other core components are manufactured outside China. While COMAC handles the aircraft's overall design and integration, the reality is that the C919 depends on a global supply chain dominated by the very companies it seeks to challenge. This dependency creates vulnerability, and as we'll see, that vulnerability is becoming increasingly problematic in today's geopolitical environment. Now we arrive at the heart of our story, the European certification saga that threatens to derail China's international ambitions for the C919. In the aviation world, certification isn't just important, it's everything. Before any commercial aircraft can carry paying passengers, it must be certified by aviation safety authorities as meeting rigorous standards for airworthiness. These certifications verify that the aircraft has been properly designed, manufactured, and tested to ensure passenger safety. The two most important certification authorities globally are the Federal Aviation Administration in the United States and the European Union Aviation Safety Agency, known as EASA. Gaining approval from either of these regulators essentially opens up the international market, as most countries around the world accept their certifications without requiring extensive additional testing. The C919 received its initial certification from China's Civil Aviation Administration, or CAAC, at the end of 2022. This allowed the aircraft to begin operating within China and recently to Hong Kong. But for airlines outside China, CAAC certification alone isn't sufficient. International carriers, along with leasing companies that finance aircraft purchases, typically require either FAA or EASA approval before they'll consider adding a new aircraft type to their fleets. COMAC made a strategic decision not to pursue FAA certification in the United States, a reflection of the deteriorating relationship between Washington and Beijing. Instead, they focused their international certification efforts on Europe, hoping that EASA approval would unlock global opportunities. The relationship between COMAC and EASA began formally in 2020 when a bilateral aviation safety agreement between the European Union and China took effect. This agreement established a framework for cooperation and mutual recognition between the two regions' aviation authorities. COMAC initially expressed confidence that they could secure EASA certification by the end of 2025, allowing the C919 to begin serving European destinations and, by extension, many other international markets that recognize EASA standards. But in the spring of 2025, those hopes were definitively dashed. Florian Guillermet, the executive director of EASA, gave an interview to the French publication L'Usine Nouvelle that sent shockwaves through the industry. Speaking from EASA's offices in Cologne, Germany, Guillermet was direct. As we officially informed them, the C919 will not be certified in 2025. We expect to certify the C919 within 3 to 6 years. 3 to 6 years. That timeline pushes certification potentially into 2028, 2029, or even 2031. Guillermet explained that while COMAC had been working with EASA for approximately 4 years, only 2 of those years had been fully productive. The certification process requires EASA to validate the aircraft's overall design and integration, conduct flight evaluations, and verify that all components meet European safety standards. Much of this work remained incomplete. We still need to conduct design validation tests for the aircraft and certain components, as well as flight trials, Guillermet noted in the interview. He emphasized that while this timeline might seem lengthy, it's actually fairly typical for new aircraft programs, especially from manufacturers without established relationships with European regulators. The average certification period for commercial aircraft ranges between 5 and 8 years. Guillermet did offer some reassurance, praising COMAC's commitment and cooperation. COMAC is highly committed and shares all the necessary information to achieve certification, he said. I have no doubt they will achieve certification. But he made clear that the process would not be rushed. For COMAC and for China, this news represented a significant setback. The company had invested enormous resources in preparing for European certification, including conducting demonstration flights and compliance checks. They had been through 3 rounds of ESA's quadruple round certification process. Progress had been made, but not nearly enough. To understand why European certification is taking so long, we need to appreciate what the process actually involves. ESA doesn't simply accept the Chinese certification and add its stamp of approval. The agency must independently verify that the aircraft meets European standards, which in many cases are more stringent than those in other regions. This means reviewing thousands of pages of technical documentation, examining design choices, testing systems, and observing the aircraft in various operating conditions. The process includes several key phases. First comes document review, where ESA examines all the technical specifications, design drawings, test reports, and manufacturing procedures. Then comes compliance demonstration, where COMAC must prove that specific systems and components meet European requirements. This is followed by inspection visits, where ESA officials travel to manufacturing facilities and supplier locations to observe production firsthand. Finally come the flight tests, extensive trials where ESA pilots fly the aircraft through various scenarios to verify its performance, handling characteristics, and safety systems. These tests must demonstrate that the aircraft behaves as designed under normal conditions, challenging conditions, and emergency scenarios. One crucial factor complicating the C919 certification is that while many of its individual components come from proven Western suppliers, the overall integration is new and untested in international service. As Guillermet explained, it is the overall design and the work of integrating this device that we have to evaluate. Even though components like the LEAP engines have been certified separately, ESA must verify that they work correctly together in the C919's specific configuration. There's also the matter of operational history. The C919 has been flying commercially within China since 2023, but its track record remains limited. ESA wants to see evidence of reliable operation over time. What maintenance issues arise? How do systems perform in various weather conditions? Are there any recurring problems that need to be addressed? Building this operational database takes time. Additionally, the bilateral aviation safety agreement between Europe and China, while facilitating cooperation, also reflects a reality. China's aviation industry is less mature than Europe's. The agreement is based on building progressive trust between the two parties. ESA cannot simply assume that Chinese manufacturing and quality control processes match European standards. They must verify this through their own investigation. Guillermet acknowledged this complexity in his interview. Under the bilateral agreement, validation of aircraft typically takes about 6 months when there's an established relationship and mutual confidence between regulators. But that timeline assumes both parties have long histories of working together. For new entrants like COMAC, the process naturally takes longer. But there's another layer to this story that cannot be ignored: the geopolitical tensions that increasingly shape the aviation industry. The certification delays must be understood within the broader context of deteriorating relations between China and the West, particularly the United States. And while ESA is a European agency, not an American one, these tensions inevitably affect European decision-making and risk calculations. The C919's dependence on American and European technology creates unique vulnerabilities. The aircraft's engines require United States export licenses because they contain American technology. In May 2025, the United States temporarily suspended these export licenses as part of escalating trade tensions, only to restore them in July. During those 2 months, COMAC's production plans were thrown into disarray. According to Dan Taylor, head of consulting at aviation consultancy IBA, trade tensions between the United States and China have directly affected delivery schedules for the C919. The suspension of engine exports highlighted how inherently sensitive to political shifts the program remains. As Taylor noted, engine and avionics dependence on Western suppliers continues to expose the program to policy decisions beyond COMAC's control. These aren't hypothetical concerns. The United States has repeatedly considered blocking or restricting technology sales to COMAC. During the first Trump administration, there were proposals to prevent GE from selling LEAP engines to China, citing concerns that the technology could be reverse-engineered for China's domestic engine development program. While President Trump ultimately opposed those restrictions, the threat remained present. With ongoing trade disputes, tariffs reaching as high as 145% on Chinese goods, and retaliatory measures including China's temporary ban on Boeing aircraft deliveries, the aviation supply chain has become weaponized in the broader United States-China competition. Each escalation creates uncertainty for COMAC's production plans and, by extension, for European regulators evaluating the aircraft's long-term viability. China is working to reduce these dependencies. The Aero Engine Corporation of China has been developing the CJ1000 engine specifically to replace the LEAP-1C. Reports from early 2025 suggested that development was progressing well with verification flights expected soon. But developing a competitive commercial aircraft engine is extraordinarily difficult, and even if the CJ1000 eventually succeeds, it will take years before it can fully replace the current Western engines. For ESA, these geopolitical complexities add another consideration to the certification process. European regulators must consider not just whether the aircraft is safe today, but whether it will remain supportable and maintainable over its expected service life of 20 to 30 years. If supply chain disruptions could ground the aircraft or create safety concerns, that affects the certification calculation. Let's talk about what this certification delay means in practical terms for COMAC's market prospects. The C919 has accumulated approximately 1,000 orders, according to Cirium data, representing about 10% of total medium-haul orders worldwide. That sounds impressive until you consider the context. The vast majority of these orders, likely over 90%, come from Chinese state-owned airlines, China Eastern, China Southern, and Air China. These are not independent market decisions based purely on economic considerations. They represent government-directed support for a national strategic program. Outside China, interest has been limited. Airlines like AirAsia have expressed curiosity about the C919, attracted by its potentially lower acquisition costs. Budget carriers in Southeast Asia and other developing regions could theoretically benefit from the aircraft's competitive pricing. But almost without exception, these airlines have made their interest conditional on obtaining international certification, specifically from ESA or the FAA. The reason is straightforward. Operating an aircraft that lacks international certification creates numerous problems. Maintenance becomes more complicated, as parts and service might not be readily available in all markets. Insurance costs may be higher due to perceived risks. Resale values remain uncertain since the secondary market for non-certified aircraft is limited. And flying to destinations that don't recognize Chinese certification could be prohibited entirely or require expensive additional validation. Without European certification, the C919 is effectively locked into the Chinese domestic market and potentially a handful of smaller markets willing to accept CAC certification alone. COMAC's older regional jet, the ARJ-21, has found some customers in countries like Indonesia, Vietnam, and Laos, where local regulators accept Chinese certification. But these are small markets compared to the global opportunity that European certification would unlock. Consider the math forecasts suggest global demand for approximately 35,000 new commercial aircraft over the next 20 years. Single-aisle jets, like the C919, represent the largest category. Even capturing 5% of this market would mean orders for over 1,500 aircraft, enough to sustain substantial production. But reaching that level requires access to international markets, which requires international certification. The 3 to 6 year delay announced by ESA means the C919 won't enter these markets until at least 2028, and possibly not until 2031. By then, both Boeing and Airbus will have been selling their latest 737 MAX and A320neo variants for over a decade. These aircraft will have mature operational records, established maintenance networks, and strong customer relationships. Breaking into this market as a late entrant, even with lower prices, will be extraordinarily challenging. There's another competitor COMAC must consider. Airbus is expanding its presence in China itself. The European manufacturer operates an assembly line in Tianjin that produces A320 aircraft for the Chinese market. A second assembly line is scheduled to begin operations in 2026, allowing Airbus to increase production in China. This means that even in its home market, the C919 faces direct competition from an aircraft that already has global certification and a proven track record. So where does this leave China's aviation ambitions? Is the C919 program doomed, or can it still succeed? The reality is more nuanced than simple success or failure. Within China's domestic market, the C919 is making genuine progress. 16 aircraft have been delivered, with operations expanding to more routes. Chinese airlines are gradually building operational experience with the type. Production rates, while still modest, are improving. The target of 30 deliveries in 2025 represents meaningful growth. For China's domestic aviation needs, these aircraft don't require European or American certification. The Chinese market alone is enormous. Remember that projection of 9,570 new aircraft needed by 2044. Even if the C919 captures only a portion of this domestic demand, it represents hundreds or potentially thousands of aircraft. That's enough to sustain a viable production program and employ tens of thousands of skilled workers. COMAC is also exploring regional expansion strategies that sidestep the Western certification bottleneck. The company has announced plans to begin serving Southeast Asian destinations by 2026, potentially operating the C919 to countries whose regulators might accept Chinese certification or might conduct their own abbreviated validation processes. Nations like Cambodia, Laos, and possibly Indonesia could provide stepping stones for international operations even without ESA approval. Over the longer term, China is investing heavily in developing indigenous alternatives to Western components. The CJ1000 engine program, if successful, would eliminate dependence on GE and Safran. Domestic suppliers are working on avionics, flight control systems, and other key components. The goal is complete technological independence, the ability to build an entirely Chinese aircraft free from Western supply chain vulnerabilities. But achieving true technological independence in commercial aviation is an immense challenge. It took decades for both Boeing and Airbus to reach their current positions. The learning curves are steep, the investment requirements are enormous, and the quality standards are unforgiving. Even if China succeeds in developing domestic alternatives for every Western component, integrating these into a certified competitive aircraft will require years of additional development. Meanwhile, ESA's certification process continues. Despite the extended timeline, Guillermet emphasized that COMAC is putting a lot of resources, commitment, and technical means into this certification. The European agency described COMAC as extremely proactive in its approach and said the company shares all the necessary information to achieve certification. This suggests that while the process is slow, it is proceeding. Industry analysts generally believe that the C919 will eventually receive European certification. The question is when and whether that timing will allow COMAC to capture meaningful market share before Boeing and Airbus further entrench their positions. The C919 story illuminates broader trends reshaping global aviation and, indeed, the global economy. For decades, the aviation industry operated as a genuinely international ecosystem. Aircraft incorporated components from around the world, with supply chains spanning continents. Airlines could purchase planes from any manufacturer that met safety standards. Technology flowed relatively freely between nations, constrained primarily by commercial considerations rather than political ones. That era is ending. What we're witnessing with the C919 is the emergence of a more fragmented, geopolitically driven aviation landscape. Technology transfer is increasingly restricted. Supply chains are being viewed as strategic vulnerabilities rather than efficiency opportunities. Certification processes are colored by diplomatic relationships and national security considerations, not just technical assessments.